Hi folks, whether you're working your way through the back catalogue still or you're listening to the latest drops, I recommend checking out the latest products that have just been posted in the shop this week. To mark the War of Independence, I've commissioned a limited set of collectible hand-painted pewter figures of Irish revolutionaries. There's 3 designs, 2 of Constance Markievicz and 1 of James Connolly. They are limited, so even if you haven't started the War of Independence series yet, check them out at irishhistorypodcast.ie/shop before they're gone.
This is for people who want to get out there, who are always up for a refreshing sea swim to clear the head, and like getting a run in whenever they can.
Or a hike on the weekend. Sure, what could be better?
This is for those who live without compromise.
This is 125 calories per pint. This is Rockshore Light.
Enjoy responsibly. Visit drinkaware.ie.
There was a monster who lived in the trees, in a house that would rattle and shake in the breeze. It was cold and small, with a terrible leak that would drip on her head and her hands and her beak. She needed it fixed and all in one batch, because she had an egg that was ready to hatch. So she went to the credit union for a renovation loan and got new windows, insulation, and extended her home. Monster loans from the credit union. Imagine more. Loans are subject to approval. Terms and conditions apply. If you do not meet the repayments on your loan, your account will go into arrears. This may affect your credit rating, which may limit your ability to access credit in the future. Credit unions in the Republic of Ireland are regulated by the Central Bank of Ireland.
The coming weeks are always a bit of a challenge. It's the business end of winter. The weather is cold and the evenings are dark. You don't want to step outside your front door. You need entertainment to come to you. Now does literally that. I'm sure you probably know the drill with Now at this stage. But Now is a one-stop shop for entertainment, from live sports through to movies and the latest series. They have a huge catalogue. At the moment, I'm really enjoying The Gilded Age. That's one for us history fans. Basically, a Downton Abbey set in the US. You really need to check it out. But Now is great no matter what you're into. My list of shows over the next couple of weeks includes their 4-part thriller, The Fear Index, and then Space Jam: A New Legacy, which drops on the 11th for something a bit light. So look, it's simple. Don't miss out. Join in and experience must-watch sport, movies and the latest entertainment on Now. Hello and welcome to the Irish History Podcast. My name is Finn Dwyer and this is Ireland's Nazi Commando. This and the following podcast will look at the story of Otto Skorzeny, a notorious Nazi with a long but forgotten connection to Ireland. It is set in the aftermath of the Second World War, to the intriguing backdrop of the hunt for Nazi war criminals after the conflict. Once labelled the most dangerous man in Europe, the focus of the podcast, Otto Skorzeny, was a man plagued by rumours of war crimes, gun-running and neo-Nazi activities all his life. His arrival in Ireland in 1957 started a dark chapter in our history, one steeped in controversy, mystery and unsettling revelations about some of Ireland's most prominent figures. In making this podcast, I was able to access previously unseen Irish intelligence reports on Skorzeny and other Nazis, along with numerous other primary sources, from governmental files in the National Archives to private papers held in the National Library. A fully referenced text is available for patrons of the show at patreon.com/Irish podcast. I would like to take a moment to thank patrons, without whose support this research would not have been possible. You can support the show at patreon.com/Irish podcast, where you can get those episode guides and extra podcasts. Finally, before I begin, there are a few terms I want to explain. In the opening section of the podcast, I refer to a relatively obscure organisation known as G2. This is Ireland's intelligence agency. I have also taken liberty with some terms to make the podcast more understandable. Because large numbers of listeners live outside Ireland, I've used English translations at all times. For example, the official title of Ireland's Members of Parliament is Teachta Dála, but I've used the English translation of this throughout. Finally, because I quote government papers and state files, some of which are quite controversial, All quotations have a slight echo to make it clear when they start and stop. Now to begin, we need some context, and I start by looking at Ireland's German community in the aftermath of the Second World War. In the early 1960s, a Time magazine article about Germans relocating to various countries in Europe contained a funny anecdote about Ireland. It began, and I quote, "At a pub near Shannon Airport, a newly landed Irish-American couple listened to the rich, incomprehensible patois of regulars at the bar. 'Just listen, Harry,' breathed the wife. 'They're talking Gaelic.' Actually, they're talking German. What the US tourists did not realise was that the natives were from West Germany, who, like scores of their compatriots, have been eagerly buying up cut-rate Irish real estate." While humorous, the article, like so many stories about migrants, is exaggerated. Ireland's German community in the mid-20th century was in reality tiny. Sure enough, there had been an increase in the German population here since the end of the Second World War, but the change was almost imperceptible. When records began in 1949, there had been 510 Germans registered as living in Ireland. Over a decade later, in 1960, this had risen to 718. In total, Germans comprised no more than 0.025% of the Irish population. Small as it was, though, this community must have been getting used to controversy and international press attention when this Time magazine article appeared in November 1962. 2 years previously, they had been the focus of far more serious international allegations and rumours. This had all started on May the 11th, 1960, in Argentina, when Israeli agents captured one of the most wanted surviving Nazis, Adolf Eichmann, who had been living in Buenos Aires. Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, had been secretly flown to Israel after his capture, where he would face trial for his crimes. When the Israeli government publicly announced his capture, attention began to focus on the whereabouts of other Nazis who had survived the war and evaded capture. Conspiracies about how they had escaped and where they were living gained currency. Soon Ireland's tiny German community became the focus of intense speculation. In that summer of 1960, the prominent Hungarian journalist Joel Brandt would make allegations that Ireland was being used as a base for a network of former Nazis who were producing passports to aid other fascists escape the continent. This story sounds fantastical for good reason. It was false. Ireland's German community were up to nothing of the sort. The Minister for Justice, Oscar Traynor, denied the allegation, and perhaps even more significantly, the Israeli ambassador at the UN privately informed the Irish government that Israel also paid no heed to Brandt's allegations. However, like all good stories, there was a grain of truth in Brandt's accusations. He did inadvertently help draw attention to some pretty unsavoury characters that were living in Ireland. While the German community in Ireland was very diverse in their political views and experiences of Hitler's Third Reich, as we shall see, there were a handful of pretty dangerous characters in Ireland by the 1960s, and the Irish authorities were turning a blind eye to their presence here. It was in the weeks after Joel Brandt's allegations that a British MP for Berkshire contacted the Irish ambassador in London with bizarre stories he had heard about a remote community in Ireland. A constituent of this MP had just returned from holidays in Bantry, County Cork, with alarming reports about Nazis buying up land in the area. Normally the MP would probably have ignored the rumours, but in light of Brandt's allegations he passed on the claims to the Irish ambassador in London. When the claims reached Dublin, they were not a surprise, however, because they were, in part at least, true. The Irish government were well aware that a former member of Hitler's entourage, Baron Alexander von Durenberg, was in fact living in the Bantry area. A former member of the SS and one-time chief of protocol in Nazi Germany, von Durenberg had bought a farm at Lugadine in Glengarriff, County Cork, in 1959. Indeed, Ireland's intelligence agency, G2, were keeping tabs on the man with some disturbing findings. Referring to von Durenberg and others in 1960, G2's intelligence files noted, "While these ex-Nazis do not indulge in political activity here, they are said to hold closed meetings and to maintain contacts with neo-Nazis in other countries." However, this did not result in von Durenberg being banned from Ireland. According to intelligence files, after coming in 1959, he returned for most of the summer of 1960, leaving at the end of August, before returning again in May 1961 for a month. The adverse publicity that von Durenberg's case attracted on the back of the Brandt allegations did result in Irish politicians refusing him a permanent visa to reside in Ireland, but ultimately they appeared to have had little concern over his Nazi past. This was hardly surprising though, given there were several former Nazis living in Ireland, and they were by and large ignored by the authorities. However, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, a far more notorious and well-known individual, Otto Rolf Skorzeny, turned up. He was far too well-known and controversial to ignore, but the reaction of Ireland's political, business and social elite was pretty shocking to say the least. Indeed, the entire Skorzeny saga that would unfold is a pretty remarkable story, one that would not only divide Ireland's small German community, but indeed the entirety of Irish society at the time. It began on May 20th, 1957, when he walked into the Irish Embassy in Madrid seeking a visa to enter Ireland. However, before we look at what happened, I want to take a few minutes to explain who exactly Otto Skorzeny was and why he was controversial. Labelled Scarface and regarded at one time as the most dangerous man in Europe, Otto Skorzeny was born in Austria in 1906. His nickname, Scarface, was due to his prominent scar which disfigured the left-hand side of his face, running across his cheek from his ear to his mouth. This, along with the fact that he was 6'4" tall and weighed around 18 stone, made him every bit a James Bond villain in appearance. After qualifying as an engineer, he joined the Nazi Party relatively early in 1931 and played a minor role when his native Austria was merged into the Nazi state in 1938. Like many of his generation, it was the Second World War that changed Otto Skorzeny's life. He joined the army and participated in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, in 1941. Struck by shrapnel, he returned to Germany, where he began work on special operations. By late 1942, the German army had suffered its catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad, a moment many on both sides recognised as the turning point in the war. Indeed, in 1943, Hitler's main ally, the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini, was deposed from power and imprisoned. It was at this moment that Hitler turned to Otto Skorzeny to rescue Mussolini. His work on special operations were prepared with such an eventuality in mind. What followed was one of the most remarkable actions of the Second World War and gained Skorzeny lifelong fame and celebrity. After finding out Mussolini was being held at a mountaintop hotel, Skorzeny led a team of commandos who successfully landed on the mountain and freed the dictator without firing a shot. The following year his standing rose further when he launched another daring attack, this time taking the son of the Hungarian dictator Miklos Horthy hostage when the Hungarians were about to switch sides in the war. While these daring missions won Skorzeny the respect of soldiers on all sides, his war record also had a darker side. A committed Nazi, he remained loyal to Hitler to the end, and in the summer of 1944, when a faction of the German army tried to kill the dictator, Skorzeny was among those who remained loyal and arrested the plotters. At Christmas 1944, during the last great German army offensive in the West, known as the Battle of the Bulge, Skorzeny led scores of Germans dressed in American uniforms behind Allied lines. During this action, deemed illegal under the laws of war, he was accused of torturing and killing US soldiers. Finally, very serious allegations implicating him of involvement in some of the worst acts of the Holocaust would later surface, but I will return to these in the next episode. For now, we can summarise Skorzeny as an individual who had carried out remarkable military raids, but at his core was a committed Nazi accused of very serious crimes during the war. Next, we will look at what happened to him as the war ended and how he arrived in Ireland. In May 1945, the Second World War came to an end when the Soviet Union and the Western Allies occupied Nazi Germany. Hitler committed suicide in late April and the German army surrendered on May 8th. Given his distinctive appearance, Skorzeny could not evade capture for long, and on May 15, 1945, he was captured by the US Army, who wanted to put him on trial for his actions during the Battle of the Bulge, where he had been accused of torturing and murdering US soldiers. Skorzeny was tried in 1947 but was acquitted when a British Army soldier testified he had used similarly illegal tactics, that of using enemy uniforms behind the lines. However, Skorzeny was not released at this point. As a prominent Nazi, he had to go through what was called a denazification court, a process that would declare him, essentially, no longer a threat. So, after the trial, he was sent to a detention camp. However, in 1948, before his case was ever heard by a denazification court, he escaped. He would later turn up living in Spain, which was then one of the last fascist dictatorships in Europe. From this point forward, Skorzeny's story becomes much more murky, as he lived somewhat in the shadows. The sources available to us are either his own accounts or those of intelligence agencies, which have left the man surrounded by myth and rumour. There are some incidents, though, which are worth mentioning. In 1949, intelligence agencies suspected Skorzeny of having aided Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, who I mentioned earlier, to escape from Europe to Argentina. While he denied involvement, his claims to have never met Eichmann were later proved false. Nevertheless, in 1952, a German court finally deemed him denazified, although, as we shall see, this judgment was probably premature. Through the 1950s, Skorzeny continued to court controversy. By 1951, he published war memoirs, and when they were carried by a French newspaper, Le Figaro, it sparked off major riots in Paris where 50 policemen were injured. In 1954, he was rumoured to have been offered 500 million francs to kidnap the former Sultan of Morocco. He was also suspected of being engaged in illegal arms dealing, specifically to the FLN, Algerian revolutionaries seeking independence from France. While the exact truth of any of these rumours is hard to decipher, the claims of his gun running to North Africa and his connection to Adolf Eichmann would resurface continually. To say that Otto Skorzeny was controversial was putting it mildly. He was detested by many in a Europe where the full extent of the Holocaust and the extermination of the Nazis' political opponents in Germany had become known. So when this man walked into an Irish embassy in Madrid on May 20th, 1957, and asked for a visa to Ireland, it was the start of one of the most controversial chapters in modern Irish history.
There's a gaggle of monsters you'll see around town, in every colour from bright pink to brown. And just like us, they have hopes, dreams and wishes. A new car, new windows, a holiday diving with fishes. They know just where to go for their dreams to come true. The local credit union who can help you out too. For all of your dreams that are big, small or strange, we've got you covered with our Monster Loan range. Monster Loans from the Credit Union. Imagine more. Loans are subject to approval. Terms and conditions apply. If you do not meet the repayments on your loan, your account will go into arrears. This may affect your credit rating, which may limit your ability to access credit in the future. Credit unions in the Republic of Ireland are regulated by the Central Bank of Ireland.
Tayto lentil chips have 40% less fat with all the great taste of Tayto. But how do we know? Well, they have Mr. Tayto's seal of approval. New Tayto lentil chips. Available in cheese and onion and sour cream and onion flavour. Pick up a bag today.
From the outset, Otto Skorzeny's story about coming to Ireland was suspicious and dubious. Visa entries to Ireland in the 1950s required 2 references from Irish citizens. This, you might imagine, would create problems for Skorzeny, given he had never been to the country. Nevertheless, he was able to provide one solid reference, a woman called Gladys Mooney, the owner of the Portmarnock Country Club in North County Dublin. Gladys Mooney later claimed her connection to Skorzeny was somewhat coincidental. According to Mooney, she and her late husband, Phil, a customs official and solicitor, had met Skorzeny while holidaying in the Mediterranean. Now, records do indicate the Mooneys had travelled to Gibraltar in 1953, so it is possible they met Skorzeny then. However, given Gladys Mooney was about to go to extraordinary lengths for the man, I find it difficult to believe her connection to him was purely as a result of a chance meeting. Furthermore, in what would today be seen as highly irregular behaviour, Gladys Mooney's sister-in-law, May Mooney, a prominent civil servant in the Department of Foreign Affairs, contacted the Irish Embassy in Madrid to vouch for this story. In any case, one would think Irish officials would want to do a little more digging in the case of a man such as Skorzeny. But in what would become a sign of what was to come, civil servants in the Departments of Justice and Foreign Affairs discussed the matter but did not give it the gravity we might expect. Ultimately, they had no objection to Skorzeny entering Ireland, with the Justice Ministry stating he was not coming for political reasons and was not of political relevance. We will see that this was at best a naive assessment. Before we continue, it's worth bearing in mind at this point that the Irish immigration policy in the 1950s was by no means lax. For example, if you were from a communist country, you couldn't get in. In 1956, one official in the Department of Justice noted, "It has been the policy of successive ministers for justice, with the tacit and sometimes explicit approval of the Taoiseach, the Prime Minister, or the government for the time, being not to grant visas to the civil or military officials of the so-called Iron Curtain countries, or even to private citizens other than refugees." Even refugees from these countries were not guaranteed to be let into Ireland. In 1959, a few months before Skorzeny applied to come, Wacław Golzowski, a Polish man who feared being severely punished by the Polish communist government if he returned, was refused refuge in Ireland. However, evidently there was no objection to high-profile Nazis, it would seem. Skorzeny eventually arrived in Ireland in June 1957. To this day, the purpose of his initial visit remains very unclear and surrounded in mystery. Certainly, from what we know of his activities, there was much more going on than what meets the eye. During his first visit to Ireland, he stayed with Gladys Mooney in the Portmarnock Country Club. It was at this plush North Dublin hotel that Skorzeny received an extraordinary welcome from the elite of Dublin society. On June 10th, 1957, Gladys Mooney hosted an evening in her country club for Skorzeny, which was attended by, and I quote a contemporary newspaper here, "well-known names in law, architecture and medicine." This was only the beginning, however. Also present was John Kelly Rogers, who at one time had been Winston Churchill's personal pilot and was then the chief pilot of Ireland's national airline, Aer Lingus. Present also was Richard Duggan, a major figure from the Irish business world. As solicitor, he was the chairman of a company called Domus Limited and the director of the Irish Hospital Trust and the Irish Glass Bottle Company, well-known entities in Irish society at the time. However, there was even more important people present. Among the several members of Parliament in attendance was the recently elected Charles J. Haughey, Ireland's notoriously corrupt future Prime Minister, and Paddy Burke, another Fianna Fáil politician, perhaps best known today, in Ireland at least, as the father of Ray Burke. While Dublin society turned out to greet Skorzeny, there were others there that asked major questions about what exactly was going on in the hotel that night. In that crowd to meet Skorzeny in the Portmarnock Hotel was also a monocle-wearing Frenchman named Beckhart, who the Evening Press journalist who was present ascertained had at one time been a member of the French intelligence service and was, by the 1950s, a banker. In which capacity he attended the Portmarnock gathering is not clear, but he had flown in from France especially to attend the meeting and was due to leave Dublin for Paris the following day. As I've said, the exact purpose of this meeting is unclear, but it was invaluable to Skorzeny to meet so many leading figures from Irish society. The presence of the one-time intelligence agent Beckhart, who had flown in from Paris for the meeting, indicates it was far more than a simple meet and greet though. Even in 1957, the event raised suspicions. The Evening Press journalist who I've quoted on several occasions so far mused afterwards, "It would be interesting, for instance, to ask Mrs. Mooney just how and why she built up her exclusive invitation list to meet this famous Commando leader." This question could be asked time and again of several high-profile figures in Irish society in the coming years. Why were they willing to aid Otto Skorzeny? And perhaps most importantly, to what end? After what was a short stay in 1957, Skorzeny left Ireland, and a year passed before he applied for another visa in 1958. This visa was also granted, but on the condition he did not travel via Britain, because he was on what was called the Home Office suspect list, a 1950s British comparison of a terrorist watch list. However, there was very little questioning in Ireland whether a man on this list should be allowed into the country, particularly given Skorzeny's past. His visa references in 1958 were Gladys Mooney again and Richard Duggan, the prominent Irish businessman whom he had met on his first visit. If the purpose of Gladys Mooney's evening in the Portmarnock Hotel had been to make connections for Skorzeny, it was clearly working. The following year of 1959, Otto Skorzeny made 3 trips to Ireland in May, July, and then he returned to spend Christmas here at the end of the year. Perhaps coincidental, but perhaps not, his visit in May overlapped with the first visit of his fellow Nazi Alexander von Durenberg. This visit changed Otto Skorzeny's relationship to Ireland, as both he and von Durenberg bought farms in 1959. While von Durenberg bought his in a remote part of County Cork, Otto Skorzeny bought Martinstown House and Estate, a plush, stately home in County Kildare, just outside Dublin. This would in time reveal exactly how Irish society viewed him, because he also began the process of applying for permanent residency here, forcing many to take a stance on the man. Some of the initial press coverage and public reaction was nothing short of sycophantic. For example, as the story that Skorzeny was possibly going to move to Ireland broke in early June 1959, P.J. Hegarty, a former army major, wrote to the Irish Times saying, "It is recognised that one would not recommend the late Adolf Hitler or his regime for the Nobel Prize. Nevertheless, as a neutral who fought directly against Colonel Skorzeny, I would say to him, good luck to you, and may you one day also, in the Valhalla of all warriors, be reunited with your other valiant comrade in arms, General Rommel." However, this press attention also finally brought out some criticism, and an Irish-American tourist and US veteran of the Second World War was one of those who took issue with the coverage Skorzeny was receiving, and wrote to the papers asking why they give Skorzeny the front page to air his distasteful views. You might expect this protege of Adolf Hitler to abuse your hospitality. The fact that Skorzeny had bought property and was planning to move to Ireland created much bigger problems, though, in the corridors of power in Ireland. In September 1959, he applied for a visa to reside here and become a farmer. Initially, the assessment of the Department of Justice was that he should be allowed to move to Ireland, given he had been here 5 times and not committed a crime. However, civil servants in Dublin asked the embassy in Madrid to make inquiries about rumours Skorzeny had been involved in arms smuggling, and he was in fact being forced to leave the fascist dictatorship in Spain. While the embassy could not verify the reports of arms smuggling, they received information which you might think would have sealed Skorzeny's fate and had him banned from Ireland. When the Irish ambassador in Spain, Michael Rinn, inquired about Skorzeny to his Canadian counterpart in Madrid, he was told the former Nazi was banned from Canada because he was, and I quote, too pro-Hitler in his outlook. Given being born east of the Iron Curtain was reason enough for many to be banned from Ireland, one would think that this sentiment, only 15 years after the end of the Second World War, would have helped the Irish authorities make up their mind on Skorzeny. It didn't. The saga involving the Nazi dragged on into the following year, and the flow of rumours and information reaching Ireland about the man just got worse. In January 1960, the Irish legate in Bern, Switzerland, forwarded a very alarming article which had appeared in the reputable Swiss newspaper Neue Zürich Zeitung on January the 12th. It had reported how the Swiss Jewish Community Alliance claimed Skorzeny was acting as a liaison officer for international neo-Nazis. However, for some reason, Irish politicians would still not ban Skorzeny, or even decide not to give him residency at this point. On February the 8th, Oscar Traynor, the Minister for Justice, informed the Department of Foreign Affairs he still favoured giving Skorzeny the permanent residency he was asking for and could see no reason not to. In 1960, all Traynor had to do was state that he did not believe Skorzeny was a man of good character, and this would have been sufficient to have the visa refused. Now, while many clearly considered Skorzeny to be a man of good character, the Minister for Foreign Affairs at the time, Frank Aiken, was not convinced. His department saw Skorzeny as, and I quote, a controversial character of some notoriety. Finally, on February the 27th, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Aiken, and the Minister for Justice, Oscar Traynor, came up with what might be considered an Irish solution to an Irish problem. Skorzeny would be allowed come and go as he pleased, and they would deal with the issue of his permanent residency when he actually wanted to come and live here. Why they didn't refuse him outright is not clear, and it is certainly suspicious. A few months later, the summer of 1960 brought with it the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina, and with it the allegations Skorzeny had helped him escape back in 1949. That summer also saw Joel Brandt make his allegations about underground Nazi networks in Ireland, and there was intense focus on the general presence of Nazis in Ireland. Given the charges that Eichmann faced, essentially planning the deaths of millions of Jews, you might think that finally Irish politicians and wider society would have been embarrassed by Skorzeny, who was at this point linked to Eichmann. This wasn't the case though. In the midst of the Eichmann controversy, in August 1960, the Dalkey Historical Literary and Debating Society invited Skorzeny to speak. Dalkey is one of Dublin's wealthiest and most prestigious suburbs, and at the meeting Skorzeny regaled the audience with his stories of rescuing Mussolini and other anecdotes from the Third Reich. Judging on newspaper reports of the meeting, no one raised Eichmann's arrest or the Holocaust. That year of 1960, one that had raised questions over Ireland's attitudes to former Nazis in general, ended in a particularly dark note. In early December, a synagogue in Dublin was damaged in what appears to have been a copycat attack, mimicking others on the continent. The words "kill Jews" and "communists", alongside the German words "Juden raus", meaning Jews out, were scrawled over the building. While this had nothing to do with Otto Skorzeny, the time had clearly arrived to sit up and take notice of the threat posed by neo-Nazis. While many politicians were willing to stand idly by, there were some in Ireland willing to take a stand. While Irish society, by and large, appeared to have no issue with Otto Skorzeny, and several politicians were inexplicably or perhaps suspiciously accommodating him, one doctor in a rural community in County Limerick was growing increasingly irate with the situation. This doctor knew more than most about the dangers posed by Nazism. His name was Georg Rosenstock, a German by birth who had moved to Ireland after the Second World War. Georg's own story was somewhat unusual. He described his background in unusual terms when he said, and I quote, "My forefathers were somewhat related with the Jewish race." Presumably able to hide this during the Third Reich, Georg trained as a doctor. He served as part of the German occupying force on the island of Guernsey, which lies just off the coast of France, where he started a relationship with an Irish woman. After the war, he moved to Ireland and established a doctor's practice in Kilfinane, County Limerick. He published books and articles in his spare time and also established a factory in the area. As early as 1960, Georg was aware that some of his fellow Germans in Ireland had very questionable pasts. Writing in the German magazine Zeit, he said some had come to Ireland to avoid what he called certain eventualities, in what seems to be an illusion of prosecution for war crimes. By 1961, Georg decided he would take action against the most prominent of these figures, Otto Skorzeny. He wrote to Ireland's leading Jewish figure, one of the longest-serving Irish members of Parliament, Robert Briscoe, about his concerns over Skorzeny. Georg's letter to Robert Briscoe, accompanied by a newspaper cutting about Skorzeny, read as follows: "With some astonishment I noticed today the Irish Independent referring to this man as Colonel. The SS organisation has been regarded all over the world as a criminal organisation, and it is in more than bad taste. It is a disgrace that the dignified rank of Colonel should be publicly applied to this man." Georg went on to question where Otto Skorzeny had earned his money, a very salient point given he had escaped from a detention camp in Germany in 1948 with nothing but the clothes on his back. While he had no evidence, Georg Rosenstock pointed out that this was a concern for those who, he said, and I quote, lost all their property by Hitler's criminal actions against the German Jews. For Robert Briscoe, himself a Jew, this undoubtedly touched a nerve. After he received the letter, Briscoe forwarded it to his Fianna Fáil colleague, the Minister for Justice, Oscar Traynor. Traynor's response was pretty shocking given the context and spoke volumes to how he and other figures in the Irish government viewed Otto Skorzeny. Rather than investigate the issue or ask maybe for more information, Oscar Traynor attacked Georg Rosenstock and gently warned Robert Briscoe that Ireland's Jewish community should steer clear of the man. Traynor's reply to Robert Briscoe reads as follows: Dear Deputy, I returned the letter and enclosed press cutting which accompanied your letter to me, with respect to which I have nothing to say, except that your correspondent is not a man on whose evidence I would not be disposed to act. I hope and believe that the Jewish community is too sensible to do so in relation to the particular matter concerning which he has written to you. Yours sincerely, Oscar Traynor. This letter is pretty explosive, but context here is very important. Traynor in this letter is referring to the fact that the Irish government did not like Georg Rosenstock. The previous year he had published an article in the German magazine Zeit, which was in parts condescending in its portrayal of rural Ireland. The Irish embassy in Germany had been outraged and even asked officials in Dublin to keep a file on Rosenstock. However, aside from this, I haven't really been able to ascertain any other controversies around Georg Rosenstock. His only foray into the political arena was a lecture he had given in 1960 on the renewed rise of anti-Semitism in Germany. In any case, no matter why they didn't like him, the fact was that Georg Rosenstock was a German with experience of these matters, who was raising very legitimate questions about Otto Skorzeny, and his outright dismissal by Oscar Traynor reveals an unwillingness to deal with Skorzeny and his past. Furthermore, it's worth bearing in mind that this letter was written only 15 years after the Holocaust had ended, and telling Irish Jews that they should be too sensible to be concerned about where former Nazis got their money is a pretty damning indictment of attitudes in Ireland. It's difficult to know specifically where this was coming from. It should be noted that by 1960, Oscar Traynor, the Minister for Justice, was 74 and his hearing was failing. He would retire the following year and die in 1963. However, the most senior civil servant in his department was the hardened anti-Semite Peter Berry. As recently as 1953, he had described Jews as, and I quote, politically undesirable, and again I quote, a social problem. However, even acknowledging this, Oscar Traynor's actions here are pretty consistent with the government's policy towards Skorzeny since he had arrived in Ireland. While it's a well-recorded fact that the Irish government was willing to overlook the case of several Nazis who had arrived in Ireland after the war, Skorzeny's case does raise very specific questions. He in particular was a major headache for Irish politicians given the press attention he received no matter where he went. Government files show that Skorzeny's presence in Ireland up to this point was damaging Ireland's reputation abroad. In this context, the attitude of leading political figures is perplexing. Why they seemed unwilling to act against a man who brought such adverse publicity but ultimately had few friends is something of a mystery. However strange this story has been so far, it was about to get far stranger. In the second podcast on Skorzeny, we will see even more serious allegations arise about the man and the goings-on his farm in Kildare. We will see more reports from G2, Ireland's intelligence agency, about plots to free Adolf Eichmann in Israel, to use Cork Harbour for gun running to North Africa, and import weapons for the Provisional IRA. I will also, in that episode, look at some theories to try and explain the strange story. The second part will be out in the coming days. Until next time, Slán. The coming weeks are always a bit of a challenge. It's the business end of winter. The weather is cold and the evenings are dark. You don't want to step outside your front door. You need entertainment to come to you. Now does literally that. I'm sure you probably know the drill with Now at this stage. But Now is a one-stop shop for entertainment from live sports through to movies and the latest series. They have a huge catalogue. At the moment, I'm really enjoying The Gilded Age. That's one for us history fans. Basically, a Downton Abbey set in the US. You really need to check it out. But Now is great no matter what you're into. My list of shows over the next couple of weeks includes their 4-part thriller, The Fear Index, and then Space Jam, A New Legacy, which drops on the 11th for something a bit light. So look, it's simple. Don't miss out. Join in and experience must-watch sport, movies and the latest entertainment on Now.
Rise to the promise of good things to come. The unexpected, the elation, the surge of energy from the stadium and pubs across the land. Settle in to the Guinness Six Nations. Get the facts, be drink aware, visit drinkaware.ie.
Hi folks, whether you're working your way through the back catalogue still or you're listening to the latest drops, I recommend checking out the latest products that have just been posted in the shop this week. To mark the War of Independence, I've commissioned a limited set of collectible hand-painted pewter figures of Irish revolutionaries. There's 3 designs, 2 of Constance Markievicz and 1 of James Connolly. They are limited, so even if you haven't started the War of Independence series yet, check them out at irishhistorypodcast.ie/shop before they're gone. Hi folks, whether you're working your way through the back catalogue still or you're listening to the latest drops, I recommend checking out the latest products that have just been posted in the shop this week. To mark the War of Independence, I've commissioned a limited set of collectible hand-painted pewter figures of Irish revolutionaries. There's 3 designs, 2 of Constance Markievicz and 1 of James Connolly. They are limited, so even if you haven't started the War of Independence series yet, check them out at irishhistorypodcast.ie/shop before they're gone.
Oh, Amy, my little one. I ask myself a million questions every day. When will you give me your first smile? How much sleep do you need? How can I help you and your big brother to get along?
At the HSE's mychild.ie and in the free My Child books, you'll find the answers you need from doctors, midwives, public health nurses, dietitians and lots of other experts. mychild.ie. Expert advice for every step of pregnancy, baby and toddler health. From the HSE.
If you have a TV, you must have a TV licence. It's the law. Choose the convenient option and pay online, anytime at tvlicence.ie. Your TV licence made easier. Brought to you by the Government of Ireland.
The coming weeks are always a bit of a challenge. It's the business end of winter. The weather is cold and the evenings are dark. You don't want to step outside your front door. You need entertainment to come to you. Now does literally that. I'm sure you probably know the drill with Now at this stage. But Now is a one-stop shop for entertainment from live sports through to movies and the latest series. They have a huge catalogue. At the moment, I'm really enjoying The Gilded Age. That's one for us history fans. Basically, a Downton Abbey set in the US. You really need to check it out. But Now is great no matter what you're into. My list of shows over the next couple of weeks includes their 4-part thriller, The Fear Index, and then Space Jam, A New Legacy, which drops on the 11th for something a bit light. So look, it's simple. Don't miss out. Join in and experience must-watch sport, movies and the latest entertainment on Now. Hello and welcome to the Irish History Podcast. My name is Finn Dwyer and this is Ireland's Nazi Commando Part 2. This is the last podcast for 2017, although there will be one more Patrons episode which will be available exclusively at patreon.com/Irish podcast. This episode continues the remarkable story of Otto Skorzeny. In the last episode, we looked at who Skorzeny exactly was, the early controversies around his arrival in Ireland, and the Irish government's refusal to ban him from the country, despite rumours about his activities. I would recommend listening to that show first, if you haven't heard it, before listening to this. In this episode, I'm going to continue the story, which only gets more fascinating and bizarre, as Ireland's intelligence agency, G2, compiled explosive reports on what Skorzeny was up to in the early 1960s, not to mention accusations of war crimes and his connections to the IRA. The show opens by looking at major allegations levelled against Skorzeny. Then I will look at whether or not these were true, how the government responded, and finally why so few in Ireland were willing to take a stand against Otto Skorzeny. There could be little doubt that Otto Skorzeny was happy with his initial experiences of Ireland, where he had been welcomed, and difficult questions regarding his Nazi past were in general limited. For such a controversial figure, who was banned from both Britain and Canada, he could scarcely have asked for more. On his initial arrival, he had been feted by well-known figures in Dublin. During his subsequent visits in the following years, the Irish newspapers had been generous in their coverage. By and large, they had focused on what might be considered the more positive aspects of his war record, primarily his rescue of the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini in 1943, while they tended not to bring up his more problematic past, for example, that he had been loyal to Adolf Hitler to the bitter end. From the early 1960s onwards, this approach to Skorzeny, however, was tested to its limits, because figures such as Skorzeny and other former Nazis came under intense scrutiny due to two major trials. As we saw in the last episode, the architect of the Holocaust, Adolf Eichmann, was captured and brought to Israel for trial in 1960. Testimonies in his trial, which began in 1961, brought the crimes of the Nazis sharply into focus again. This was followed by another series of trials in 1964, when the West German government tried over 20 people charged with terrible crimes in the Auschwitz death camp. Throughout the period, claims repeatedly linked Skorzeny to figures involved in these horrific acts, and on one occasion he was accused of involvement himself. From an Irish perspective, though, the country's intelligence agency, known as G2, began to pry into the man, and they also came up with pretty startling accusations which should have been a concern for Irish politicians. Now, as early as 1961, G2 had produced two specific separate reports on Skorzeny and sent them to Ireland's police force, who would in turn forward most of the details to the government. While intelligence files can actually be surprisingly dull, these files on Otto Skorzeny exceed our wildest flights of fancy. Fascinating, intriguing, and in parts pretty unbelievable, they informed the Irish government what infiltrators and agents suspected Skorzeny was up to in the 1960s, and he was by no means the innocent former soldier he would have had many people believed. The first of these intelligence reports was written on February the 25th, 1961, and was sent to the Irish police. It read as follows: "Information, unconfirmed at this stage, from a delicate but very reliable source, indicates that international arms dealers have been in touch with Otto Skorzeny with a view to setting up an arms dump in this country for later transshipment to Africa for sale to dissident elements in that continent. Cork Harbour is mentioned as the port of entry and dispatch of the arms. At present, however, the scheme is only at the planning stage and no arms have been landed here. Otto Skorzeny, a former major in Hitler's SS Corps, who resides at Martinstown House, County Kildare, is internationally known for his part in the successful rescue of Mussolini from imprisonment in September 1943. I must stress this source is delicate and needs maximum protection, and until such a time as information can be confirmed, no action should be taken to compromise the source or to place Skorzeny under any embarrassment or disadvantage. It is possible that we shall hear more on this, in which case I will let you know immediately." While this was pretty alarming, the Irish police, bizarrely, did not seem particularly perturbed. It would take them 2 months before they replied to G2, stating they had finally notified the police in Cork. while the government were made aware of the files, nothing was ever done about it. The allegation may not have been proof, but one would think such suspicions would make Irish politicians increasingly dubious and nervous about Skorzeny. However, it seems to have little impact. Now, if this wasn't enough, a few months later, in July 1961, another report emerged, which was far more explosive. This report began, "Whilst we have no further information connecting Skorzeny with trafficking in arms, you may be interested in the following information. The source on this occasion is a casual one whose reliability we cannot judge. Skorzeny is reported to have had in the past few months meetings with Ulrich Rudel, Oswald Mosley, Leon de Grelle, one of Eichmann's sons, and others unnamed in Germany and Spain." Now, the link between Skorzeny and these individuals is very significant. The German Ulrich Rudel and the Belgian Leon de Grelle, both veterans of the Second World War, along with the English fascist Oswald Mosley, were probably the most prominent neo-Nazis of the post-war period. The link alone certainly gave the Irish government further food for thought about who Skorzeny was and what exactly he was up to. But it was the purpose of the meeting between Skorzeny and these neo-Nazis that was truly explosive, if it was accurate. According to G2's source, they were planning what would have been one of the most audacious missions of all time. According to the report, Otto Skorzeny, Ulrich Rudel, Leon de Grelle, and others were plotting to break Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, out of prison in Israel, or, failing that, execute him. One way or another, their goal seems to have been to try and stop Eichmann testifying at his trial in Israel. It appears that G2 did not really know what to make of such allegations. Their report continued, "Some of this information sounds improbable, but nevertheless I thought I should pass it on to you just in case there might be some substance in it." These allegations contained in the G2 reports of using Cork Harbour for gun running and potentially killing or rescuing Adolf Eichmann deserve further examination, but first I want to look at other claims around Skorzeny in the 1960s before assessing the truth of them. While Ireland's intelligence agency would not be able to add to their explosive claims, the scandal and accusations around Otto Skorzeny was almost ceaseless in the early 1960s. In 1962, the French newspaper Le Monde made accusations that he was using Ireland for neo-Nazi activities. This was followed in 1963 by the most serious of all allegations levelled against Skorzeny. Early that year, the Austrian government announced publicly they wanted to extradite him to Austria to face extremely serious charges. They were claiming Skorzeny had tested a prototype of a gas gun on inmates of a concentration camp, a charge that for the first time directly linked Skorzeny to the notorious Nazi concentration camps. If this wasn't enough controversy for Skorzeny in 1963, he also attended a memorial for the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini in Spain, organised by the Spanish Falange, a fascist organisation. In 1965, the Irish consulate in San Francisco sent clippings from American newspapers which claimed his farm in Kildare was being used by former Nazis on the run. However, the most important of these newspaper reports from an Irish perspective appeared in the British newspaper The Telegraph in 1971. Prior to this, there had never been any suggestion that Otto Skorzeny had interfered in domestic politics in Ireland, but in the late 1960s, politics in Ireland changed dramatically and Skorzeny may have taken an interest for the first time. In 1968, what we know as the Troubles erupted when demands of the nationalist community in Northern Ireland for equal rights were met with force and violence. As the tensions deepened, this led to a full-scale conflict between Republican organisations on the one hand and the British authorities on the other. As this war escalated in the early 1970s, the main Republican military grouping, the Provisional IRA, were desperate to procure weapons. A leading Republican, Daithí O'Connell, for example, is believed to have bought weapons in the communist Czechoslovakia in 1971. However, according to an extensive investigation published in The Telegraph that same year, another provisional leader, named as Rory O'Brady, better known in Ireland as Rory O'Brodick, and his wife Patricia travelled to Lloret del Mar in Spain, where they reportedly met Skorzeny with a view to buying weapons. If true, this would have had very serious implications for Skorzeny, given he was now getting involved in explicitly illegal activity in Ireland. However, he would never return to the country after this, some citing the publishing of this story as the reason. Whatever the truth of that, Otto Skorzeny's last visit to Ireland was probably in 1969. In 1971, he severed his connection completely when he sold his house here. Now, so far in this podcast, I've detailed 4 serious allegations made against Otto Skorzeny, namely that he tried to use Cork Harbour to ship guns to North Africa, that he tried to help Adolf Eichmann escape, or failing that, kill him, that he was guilty of war crimes, and finally that he met a senior IRA figure in Spain with a view to importing weapons into Ireland. After the break, I want to look at the validity of these claims, how Irish politicians reacted to them, and then, to finish, I want to look at some reasons why Skorzeny, despite all these allegations, received the relatively positive treatment he did in Ireland. But first, that break.
We asked around for people to describe Smithwick's in one word. Here's how we got on. It's smooth, rich, sweet, toasted, biscuity, malty, roasted, summery, cozy, timeless, tingly, weighty, caramelly, crisp, and refreshing tasting. Hopefully that clears things up. Smithwick's. Indescribably delicious since 1710. Get the facts, be drink aware, visit drinkaware.ie.
Jack, everyone asks me if you're teething when you cry, but can you be teething all the time? Maybe you're hungry, or you're sad and need a little cuddle, or maybe it's something else.
At the HSE's mychild.ie and in the free My Child books, you'll find the answers you need. From doctors, midwives, public health nurses, dietitians, and lots of other experts. mychild.ie. Expert advice for every step of pregnancy, baby, and toddler health. From the HSE.
Many of the claims made against Otto Skorzeny by Irish intelligence, the Austrian government and the Telegraph newspaper sound like something from a novel, so I want to take them one at a time and see how they stand up. The first claim was that he was going to use Cork Harbour to ship guns to North Africa. Irish intelligence never heard any more about this, but judging on their source cited in the report referenced earlier in the show, it does seem G2 were pretty sure there was truth to this rumour. They also had access to other circumstantial evidence, is probably the best way to describe it, in their file on Skorzeny. After the arrival of the prominent Algerian rebel Dr. Tejini Haddam in Ireland in 1961, Ireland's intelligence agency G2 noted his visit may have been in some way connected with the allegation about Skorzeny's implication in arms smuggling to North Africa. There is, however, no information to link Tejini and Skorzeny directly. Obviously, it's impossible to know what exactly Skorzeny was involved in and whether Ireland was used, but there's no doubt he was an international arms dealer. For example, the Irish government later learned he was known to the South African government for this very reason, because he had shipped them weapons, and in 1971 he would admit the fact himself that he had been involved in arms dealing. Next, we move on to the more suspect claims that he was involved in a bizarre plot to free or kill the architect of the Holocaust, Adolf Eichmann, then in prison in Israel. This is truly extraordinary. There's no doubt the likes of Skorzeny had good reason to stop Adolf Eichmann testifying at his trial in Israel. Skorzeny himself had been accused of aiding Eichmann escape Europe back in 1949. But in 1961, in a lengthy letter to the Irish Times, he had denied ever meeting Eichmann, a claim he knew to be false. Skorzeny was probably very worried about what Adolf Eichmann would say when he testified. Indeed, when Eichmann did eventually take the stand, he admitted he had met Skorzeny on a few occasions. Given Skorzeny's activities in special operations during World War II, it is conceivable he entertained the idea of rescuing or killing Eichmann. However, I have to say, it does sound improbable. Eichmann was being held in a top security prison in Israel, which had even had anti-aircraft batteries installed in the case of such a rescue attempt. In the end, this plan came to nothing. Tried and found guilty, Adolf Eichmann was executed in 1962. The most serious of all claims against Otto Skorzeny was that he tested a gas gun on concentration camp victims. Skorzeny himself adamantly denied this allegation, claiming it had been invented by the Soviet Union. Some years later, an official in the Irish embassy in Madrid asked the press attaché in the German embassy, a certain Mr. Kilster, what he thought of the claims. Kilster, while he did not know for certain, implied to the Irish official that he thought, and I quote an embassy report here, "Skorzeny is quite capable of anything." Finally, this brings me to the last major claim, that Otto Skorzeny met the provisional IRA leader Rorio Braudig in Lloret del Mar in Spain in 1971. Like the other allegations, we're never going to know for certain the truth behind this, but it is entirely possible. In 1971, the Provisional IRA were desperate to procure weapons. Sadly, intelligence files held in the military archives offer little by way of what G2 thought about this. The original origin of this story, the British newspaper The Telegraph, was not an impartial source by any means. It is sometimes referred to as the Torygraph, a reference to its close connections to the British Conservative Party, then in power in the United Kingdom. While this does need to be borne in mind, there are several factors, though, which lend credence to the story. First of all, the Telegraph's investigation was very extensive, with 3 journalists, Peter Burkett in Dublin, David Norris in London, and Harold Siv in Madrid, all working on the story. Furthermore, Rorio Braudig and his wife did not deny they had been in Spain in the summer of 1971, a trip which could be considered somewhat unusual behaviour. I somehow doubt that Rorio Braudig, a man who by this stage was the president of Sinn Féin and a member of the IRA Army Council, decided he would take a break and head for a sun holiday in the Costa Brava during what was a pivotal moment in the war in the north. It's simply not plausible. His wife Patricia was not exactly convincing either when questioned on the matter, and said, "We are not saying anything about meeting anyone." With each of these allegations being extremely serious in terms of how we might imagine the Irish government would view Skorzeny's presence in the country, I want to conclude by looking at how the Irish government dealt with these allegations. Any one of the allegations that swirled around Otto Skorzeny in the 1960s could and arguably should have been enough to get him banned from the country, given this was in the government's gift at any point. While the minister who had dealt with the case since his arrival, Oscar Traynor, retired in 1961, he was replaced by one of Ireland's most ambitious politicians of the era, his constituency colleague Charles J. Haughey. Haughey, who would later go on to become Ireland's Prime Minister on 3 separate occasions between the late 1970s and the early 1990s, is today synonymous with the corruption that defined his party, Fianna Fáil, in the last quarter of the 20th century. In terms of our story, it's also worth bearing in mind that Charles Haughey was present in the Portmarnock Country Club back in 1957 when Otto Skorzeny first arrived in Ireland and was welcomed by Dublin's elite. That is covered in the first podcast on Skorzeny. But in fairness to Haughey, he could not have known he would end up Minister for Justice handling Skorzeny's case. While Oscar Traynor's handling of the Skorzeny issue had been far from desirable, as we saw in the last podcast, Haughey's main test on the issue came in 1963, when allegations of Skorzeny's involvement in testing weapons on concentration camp inmates broke. In light of the revelations, Dr. Noel Brown, a member of the Irish Parliament, wishing to expose the fact that Skorzeny could visit Ireland as he pleased for up to 3 months each year, pressed Haughey, saying, "Is it a fact that this man has property in this country and has the right to come into the country at present?" Haughey replied and created confusion when he seemed to imply Skorzeny was actually banned from Ireland now. Haughey said he has no right to come to reside in this country. Many interpreted this as evidence that Ireland had finally decided to ban Skorzeny, which, given the charges levelled against him, would not have been surprising. Indeed, Haughey's comments made international headlines. This was a hot topic in general, given Adolf Eichmann was awaiting execution in Israel and Germany was preparing for its first major war crimes trials since the 1940s. That Ireland finally seemed to be taking action against Skorzeny naturally then attracted attention. However, Haughey had not banned Skorzeny. He was only muddying the waters with what I think was probably an intentional wordplay. When the Irish Embassy in Bonn, West Germany, contacted the Department of Justice in Dublin asking for a clarification, they confirmed Haughey accidentally, or perhaps intentionally, had created a false impression Skorzeny was banned. When he said he has no right to come to reside in this country, Haughey was referring to the fact that Skorzeny did not have the natural rights of an Irish citizen, but this didn't stop him entering the country as a visitor. He hadn't been banned. If, and I suspect he was, Charles Haughey was being intentionally vague, he had good reason to be in 1963. Otto Skorzeny had always drawn adverse press attention, but was nothing short of a national embarrassment by this stage, so a few headlines that implied Ireland had banned the man would not have done any harm. Ultimately, none of the allegations had any impact on the Irish government, though. Skorzeny would continue to travel to Ireland unfettered, albeit less frequently, as the 1960s progressed. His last visit appears to have been in 1969, and he sold his house here in 1971, dying 4 years later in 1975. If any questions remained over the political allegiances of the man Ireland had welcomed over the previous 18 years, these were answered at his funeral. I have posted a video of this funeral in the Patron's Guide available at patreon.com/Irish podcast, where you can see a coffin draped in red, white and black, the colours of Nazi Germany, while many mourners have their right arm outstretched in a Nazi salute. Finally then, I want to look at why Ireland adopted such a lenient position towards this controversial and generally detestable figure. It's undeniably true that nothing had ever been proven against Otto Skorzeny. However, he wasn't a normal figure. This sorry saga began only 12 years after the end of the Second World War, when the crimes of Nazi Germany had been revealed to the world, and we're talking about a prominent figure in that regime, and one continuously surrounded by claims of illegality at that. When I question the Irish government actions, I'm not saying they should or even could have tried him for anything. That wasn't their role. However, there was no reason to let the man enter the country either. He could have been easily refused, as a Department of Foreign Affairs memo in 1960 pointed out. The Minister for Justice can at any point order an alien to leave the state. As we know, Irish politicians never asked Skorzeny to leave. From the start, the Irish government knew his presence here was liable to cause problems, yet they went ahead. In 1957, one government official noted, "Of course, if the Skorzenys come here, there may be some adverse comment in the English press, but I think we should be prepared to endure that with fortitude." After this, there were several points in the coming years when they could and should have reversed this position, but the government didn't, and why they acted in this manner is a perplexing question. The simplest and most straightforward answer would be that somehow they had an ideological affinity with Skorzeny and wanted to protect him. As I've said, Otto Skorzeny was a neo-Nazi. His funeral footage, if anything, illustrates that he consorted with Nazis all his life. For all their faults, though, the Irish government were not Nazis, nor were they Nazi sympathisers, so that does not explain their actions. That said, it must be noted, in general, Ireland had a more lax attitude to the far right when it came to immigration. In 1962, they allowed the American George Lincoln Rockwell, the founder of the American Nazi Party, enter Ireland. Their differing approach to other countries was exposed when Rockwell was subsequently banned from entering Britain. While outright sympathy with fascism was not a factor and does not explain why they acted like this, other unsavoury attitudes may have exerted influence and may in part help us understand why Ireland allowed these figures such as Rockwell and Skorzeny in. This was anti-Semitism. The department responsible for directly dealing with Skorzeny was the Department of Justice. Throughout the entire period, the leading official in that department was Peter Berry, an individual who is deeply anti-Semitic. His quote from the last episode on this topic, where he referred to Jews as politically undesirable and a social problem, spoke volumes to this. This might explain why the Department of Justice, under his tutelage, did not view some of Skorzeny's associations with the same gravity as others did. While this may have created an atmosphere where Skorzeny was not viewed with the same hostility as he was elsewhere, it seems to me there might have been other factors at play. It is possible that the Irish government, for example, had started down a road in allowing Skorzeny to enter Ireland and then did not want to back down when it came in for criticism, especially in the British press. That said, there's little evidence in government files that any officials, even those dubious of Skorzeny, felt he should be banned from the country. And when we look at wider society, there's little evidence that the general public either were perturbed by his presence here. Ultimately, it's very difficult to understand. To conclude, I want to give my opinion on one theory that is complete conjecture. I will preface this by saying I didn't find any specific evidence to back this up, but given the nature of the theory, it is unlikely that such evidence would exist. It is conceivable that there was some level of corruption involved in the Skorzeny case. Of the two ministers who dealt with the case, there was never any insinuation that Oscar Traynor was corrupt. He is in fact one of the most respected politicians of the early 20th century. But from 1958 onwards, Charles Haughey was becoming an increasingly influential figure in the Department of Justice. Haughey would later be exposed as a deeply corrupt figure. It is conceivable then that at some point Skorzeny paid Irish political figures to allow him to continue entering the country. This is, however, as I've said, complete conjecture on my part. Before I finish, I do want to draw attention to one aspect of the story that I find completely perplexing, and this is something I mentioned in the last podcast. You may remember that a woman called Gladys Mooney acted as Skorzeny's reference on his visas in 1957 and 1958, and then went to quite extraordinary lengths for the Nazi. She used what were quite extensive contacts to help Skorzeny meet leading figures in Dublin society at an event in 1957. What Gladys Mooney's connection to and motives were for helping this man is anyone's guess. If you have any theories or knowledge on this, I'd love to hear it. You can let me know at history@irishhistorypodcast.ie. That's history@irishhistorypodcast.ie. That's where I'm leaving it for 2017, folks. Thanks to everyone who's downloaded the show, who's been in touch throughout the year, and most importantly, to all the patrons who have supported this show. I hope you all have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I'll be back in mid-January with the series on the Great Famine. If in the meantime you want to get more shows, there's tons of extra content available on Patreon at patreon.com/Irish podcast. That's patreon.com/Irish podcast. I will have a Christmas special up there in the coming days. Until next year, Slán. The coming weeks are always a bit of a challenge. It's the business end of winter. The weather is cold and the evenings are dark. You don't want to step outside your front door. You need entertainment to come to you. Now does literally that. I'm sure you probably know the drill with Now at this stage. But Now is a one-stop shop for entertainment from live sports through to movies and the latest series. They have a huge catalogue. At the moment, I'm really enjoying The Gilded Age. That's one for us history fans. Basically, a Downton Abbey set in the US. You really need to check it out. But Now is great no matter what you're into. My list of shows over the next couple of weeks includes their 4-part thriller, The Fear Index, and then Space Jam and New Legacy, which drops on the 11th for something a bit light. So look, it's simple. Don't miss out. Join in and experience must-watch sport, movies and the latest entertainment on Now.
Rise to the promise of good things to come. The unexpected, the elation, the surge of energy from the stadium and pubs across the land. Settle in to the Guinness Six Nations. Get the facts, be drink aware, visit drinkaware.ie.
Hi folks, whether you're working your way through the back catalogue still or you're listening to the latest drops, I recommend checking out the latest products that have just been posted in the shop this week. To mark the War of Independence, I've commissioned a limited set of collectible hand-painted pewter figures of Irish revolutionaries. There's 3 designs, 2 of Constance Markievicz and 1 of James Connolly. They are limited, so even if you haven't started the War of Independence series yet, check them out at irishhistorypodcast.ie/shop before they're gone.